as people join us, they will get to participate in our session today. As always, we are also joined here by our own Adrienne Rubin, who will be gifting us some artistic midrash for the story that we'll be studying today. And we'll be learning we're learning Torah through the lens of art, and we're looking forward very much to that. Thank you so much, Adrienne. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now. We're going to jump in tonight and talk about Solomon. With all of these stories, it's always interesting for us to think about the way in which we grew up thinking about these characters. Maybe not all of us had the opportunity to study in depth these characters, but we know certain things about Solomon, right? So like if you were just going to put into the chat right now, what do you remember about Solomon? What comes to mind?
Wise.
Oh, wise. Okay, yeah. You could also just, if anybody wants to type into the chat, that's fine, Carol, no problem. So yes, so Carol said wise, right? We know often we hear stories about Solomon's wisdom. Adrienne says judgment. Great. Okay. So just as people are coming in, I just want you to think about what are the things that you're bringing into the session tonight? What do you think of when you think about Solomon? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he, powerful? Is he, outspoken, kind of gregarious? What are his characteristics? We have so far learned about Saul and David, and we know that they each have their own personalities, their own kind of iconic leadership style, if you will. And Solomon does as well. And we're going to see, we get to spend a lot of time with Solomon in his life, learning about the different paths that his life takes. And so tonight we're going to hit some of those notes. But so I always like to try to tie our class to the ones before it. So where did we leave off? You might remember that we left off way back in 2 Samuel, at the beginning of 2 Samuel. We learned last time we were together about David and his illicit and somewhat disturbing affair with Bathsheba, who was married to Uriah the Hittite, and then and Bathsheba then became pregnant with David's child, and David was very careful to not get into a situation with Bathsheba's husband, and so he sent the husband to the front lines, and he was killed. And then Bathsheba becomes his wife and moves in to David's house. So this is where we left off. And we learn that God was very, very angry about David's behavior, and that God afflicts this child to become very ill and eventually to die. The child doesn't survive. So you can see on the screen here, this is just a snippet from that last scene where David finds out that this child is dead. And almost immediately after, we learn that David goes back to Bathsheba and lies with her, and then they have a new child who survives, and that child is Solomon. And it says here on the screen, you can see that God favored Solomon, and that God sent a message through the prophet Nathan about Solomon's arrival. So we have here a very interesting dynamic where the story of Solomon starts off differently from the past kings that we've seen. But I'd say similarly, there's, we see a disruption from David's first child, right? David's first child is killed, and Solomon steps in as the chosen one. And what we see next, which we'll look at in a minute, is how do we get from this moment where Solomon is born and God is favoring him to the moment where he actually rises up to become king. So we're going to fast forward now. We're going to zoom through the rest of 2 Samuel. Oh, we all read it. It was so enjoyable. It's so juicy. And we hung on every word. And now we have arrived into the book of Kings. And that's where we're going to be tonight, in the book of 1 Kings, specifically, where we follow the life of Solomon. So I'm going to share my screen with you one more time, and we will look together at this text. Okay, so we have fast forwarded now to the end of David's life. Okay, I'm going to make the screen big in 1 minute, but just want to talk to you. So the David is at the end of his life, and David has now several women in his life, including Bathsheba, but he has several women and children from different women, and there is an expectation that there's a challenge in the narrative about who should be the king. Okay, and so the even though if you were only reading what I showed you on the screen, you'd see that in 2 Samuel 12, this son was born and God favored this son, and you might think, oh, that's the end of that. We know where this story is headed. Obviously, Solomon is going to be the king. But if you fast forward to 1 Kings, you will see that there's a very loud conflict. And the conflict is between David's two children, Adonijah and David. And Adonijah believes that he should be the king because he is older than David. But there's a special relationship that David has with Bathsheba that is articulated in the text that we're going to look at. And so I wanted to bring this to you because I don't know if you remember the different ways that we've seen our kings become anointed, become kings. You might remember that when we had Saul as a king, he was anointed in private and then announced publicly. And he became king. He was anointed as king even before he told his family that he was going to become the king. It was like it happened in secret, and then he was like, oh yeah, and now I'm the king. And we see something kind of similar here in Solomon's story, and I wanted to share that with you. So let me see how I can make my screen big here. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so this is from the end of 1 Kings, the end of 1 Kings chapter 1. It says, King David's response was, summon Bathsheba. She entered the king's presence and stood before the king, and the king took an oath, saying, as the Lord lives, who has rescued me from every trouble, the oath I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, that your son Solomon should succeed me as king, and that he should sit upon my throne in my stead, I will fulfill this very day. Bathsheba bowed low in homage to the king, with her face to the ground, and she said, "May my Lord King David live forever." Then King David said, "Summon me the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada." When they came before the king said to them, "Take my loyal soldiers and have my son Solomon ride on my mule and bring him down to Gihon. Let the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan anoint him there over king of Israel, whereupon you shall sound the horn and shout, 'Long live King Solomon.' Then march up after him and let him come in and sit on my throne, for he shall succeed me as king. Him I designate to be ruler of Israel and Judah." Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, spoke up and said to the king, "Amen. And may the Lord, the God of my lord the king, so ordain. As the Lord was with my lord the king, so may he be with Solomon, and may he exalt his throne even higher than the throne of my lord King David." Then the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan and Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, went down with the Cherethites and the Pelethites. They had Solomon ride on King David's mule, and they led him to Gihon. The priest Zadok took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. They sounded the horn, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon." All the people marched up behind him, playing on flutes and making merry, till the earth was split open by the uproar. So let's just pause here. What do you see so far in this this ritual? What do you notice here? Cecile.
Unless I missed it, David, the former, is still alive. We usually don't have a new king until the old king is gone. And the people seem very happy about having a new king.
That's a really astute observation, Cecile. Actually, our favorite commentator, David Alter, makes a note about that. And he says that generally somebody would say somebody should be king after me. But in this text, it says he will be king in my stead, implying that Solomon will succeed him, but that Solomon will replace him on the throne while he is still alive. And it's interesting that he does that, because I feel like it's kind of an almost an admission on David's part that he is not up to this task anymore, and that he needs very badly to pass that torch of leadership now and not wait. Great point. What else do people notice here?
Well, to me, it seems like it's not just a succession plan. He wanted to make it a fait accompli, that now it's done. And so you really have no say, and it's, this is the way it's going to be.
That's right. Right. So there's this tension between these two children of David. And I think this is this explicit kind of coronation process is necessary in order to cement Solomon in that position, so that there's nobody who can question it. In fact, right, the what follows in the text that's on our screen is basically that that Adonijah hears this, and he says, like, "What do you mean they've been shouting, 'Long live the king'? Like, did he actually get anointed? Did he actually sit on the throne? Is he the king, or do they just want him to be the king?" And this series of rituals, sitting in the throne, being anointed, sitting on his mule, being called king, allows for there to be no doubt that is in fact what has happened. Viva, I'm just in class right now. I see them. I'm so proud of you. Good job.
This one has a difference.
But Can we talk about it later? Thank you. We just bought new books at the book fair, so we're very excited. Okay, so let's okay, sorry. So other thoughts on this before we move on? Oh, Adrienne. Yes, hello.
Hello. I was just going to say, I found it interesting that in her gratitude, Bathsheba kind of says, like, essentially, long live the king, ironically, as he's about to relinquish his title.
Yeah, in a different class that wasn't about King Solomon, we would talk about Bathsheba, especially in this episode. Bathsheba seems to take a aggressive and very strategic stance as what's it called, Queen Mother. She is eagerly awaiting the opportunity to serve as Queen Mother. She's kind of been in the wings of David's monarchy ever since she came on board, and we don't actually hear from her between last session when she says, I am pregnant with your child, until now. We don't hear about her at all for almost the whole book of 2 Samuel. And then she pops back up here when it's time to stand up for her son and advocate for him, maybe even kind of trick King David into convincing him that, he promised the throne to Solomon this whole time, possibly even taking advantage of his age and his capabilities. That's not entirely clear, but it does seem like he could go either way. He doesn't really care who's going to be king next. And there are different voices advocating for who should be king. And Bathsheba really, she takes this position where she is his trusted advisor in this moment. And we know that, it will serve her, right? Because her son is about to become the king. Okay, so that happens in chapter 1, and we think that's that. Then we get to 1 Kings chapter 2. And here we see that the official transition of power from David to Solomon, because David is on his deathbed. It says, when David's life was drawing to a close, he instructed his son Solomon as follows: I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and following his ways, his commandments, his rules, and his admonitions, as recorded in the teaching of Moses, in order that you may succeed in whatever you undertake and wherever you turn. Then the Lord will fulfill the promise that he made concerning me. If your descendants are scrupulous in their conduct and walk before me faithfully with all their heart, soul, your line on the throne of Israel shall never end. And then he goes into a series of instructions for David, like, oh yeah, one more thing, before I die, let me just tell you who all of my enemies are and where all of the kind of hiccups might happen, so that you can, run the country successfully. And then it ends where it says, so David slept with his fathers and he was buried in the city of David. The length of David's reign over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron, and he reigned 33 years in Jerusalem. And then it says, and Solomon sat upon the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. So you can see I wanted just to open this class up with these 3 vignettes, right? 3 moments where we see Solomon being set up to be the king. The first moment is when he's born. We know that God is looking favorably upon Solomon and tells the prophet Nathan that this is the guy, which in the David story is what we know. That's what makes it really a king, is that God is with them. And then there's a power struggle between David's two children and between Nathan and Bathsheba, they're able to really cement Solomon's position. And then they even go so far as to have this explicit ritual where Solomon becomes anointed as the king. But it's his rule is not firmly established, right, until this moment where he sits on the throne once King David has passed away. Any questions about that so far? No. Okay. So now we're going to get to the story, that, you know, the most famous story that we have. I just want to pull it up. Okay. So this is a real tight series of chapters. I feel there's so much to cover today, and you might wonder, like, why are we reading entire chapters of the book of First Kings? And it's because, as you can see, they're so tightly packed with narrative and drama and also a lot of information. So we now move into First Kings 3, where Solomon is the king, and right away he allies himself to Egypt by marrying the daughter of Pharaoh. Okay. And then we see this really beautiful moment. I think it's beautiful, where Solomon goes to make sacrifices to God, and has a conversation with God. So it says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, ask, what shall I grant you? So God is with Solomon in his dream. And Solomon really opens up his heart to God and says, you dealt most graciously with your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in integrity of heart. You have continued this great kindness to him by giving him a son to occupy his throne, as is now the case. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am a young lad with no experience in leadership. Your servant finds himself in the midst of the people you have chosen, a people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Grant then that grant your servant an understanding mind to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people of yours? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, and God said to him, because you asked for this, you did not ask for long life, you did not ask for riches, you did not ask for the life of your enemies, but you asked for discernment in dispensing justice. I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind. There has never been anyone like you before, nor anyone like you will rise again. I also grant you what you did not ask for, both riches and glory, all your life, the like of which no king has ever had. And I will further grant you long life if you will walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments, as did your father David. Then Solomon awoke. It was a dream. He went to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented offerings of well-being. And he made a banquet for all of his courtiers. Okay, so in a minute, we're going to read and experience the most famous story, I think, about King Solomon. And that story is supposed to demonstrate Solomon's wisdom. But I want to just take a step back, because we don't often talk about the passage that we just read, which is that Solomon comes to God and asks for this wisdom, right? What are some of the things that you noticed about Solomon's character in this conversation that he has with God? What are some words you might use to describe Solomon's character?
I would say he's humble.
Yes, he is humble. he definitely is trying to acknowledge what he doesn't know, right? He's saying, these are the areas where I might fall short, where I'm ill-equipped to address this leadership role that I'm having. What else? What are some other characteristics? I want you to think back, if you've been with us these past several months, about some of the characteristics of our other kings. And maybe that might help you think about this king. What characteristics do you see in Solomon that you have or have not seen with David or Saul?
Seems insecure in his own way. He's and maybe even a little scared and overwhelmed.
In what way do you think he's insecure, Jim?
I know, it just seems that just the opposite from being arrogant. I mean, he comes from royal birth and he sees all these people too numerous to count.
Yeah.
And he just wonders, is he really up to the task?
Right. So maybe overwhelmed, right?
Yeah.
Maybe overwhelmed would be a better, more accurate word than insecure, right? Like maybe he feels overwhelmed by the people, by the number of people he has to rule. I also feel like, on the other hand, he is not backing down from this challenge, right? Unlike Saul, who hid behind the luggage, right? He's showing up to work. He's ready to do the job, but he is asking for help, right?
But he's also being deferential and respectful.
Yes. Yeah. He is deferential and respectful. Absolutely. I just adore this little hallmark moment between Solomon and God. He's really proud of, he's proud to be in this role. He's asking for wisdom. He wants to do a good job. And then God's message is also like, it's not very characteristic of our biblical God. It feels almost like a Greek myth, like a parable almost. You could have asked for wealth and long life, but instead you asked for a wise heart. And because you were such a good asker, now I'm going to give you wealth and long life, So it's an unusual moment, but what I appreciate about it, especially, is that we get this introduction to Solomon's reign through this prayer. This is what we now know about Solomon, right? This is his kind of one of his first acts as king, is to have this beautiful conversation with God where he asks for wisdom. And then he wakes up from this dream, and this is the next episode that we have in our story, the immediate next line, right? So we have this story about these two women who come to the king and stand before him. The first woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. On the third day after I was delivered, this woman also gave birth to a child. We were alone. There was no one else in the house, just the two of us in the house. During the night, this woman's child died because she lay on it. She arose in the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant was asleep and laid with him in her bosom. She laid her dead son in my bosom. When I arose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, it was not the son I had born." The other woman spoke up, "No, the live one is my son and the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead boy is yours. Mine is the live one." And they went on arguing before the king. And the king said, "One says, 'This is my son, the live one, and the dead one is yours.' And the other one says, 'No, the dead boy is yours. Mine is the live one.' So the king gave the order, 'Fetch me a sword.' A sword was brought before the king. And the king said, 'Cut the live child in two and give half to one and half to the other.' But the woman whose son was the live one pleaded with the king, for she was overcome with compassion for her son. 'Please, my lord,' she cried, 'give her the live child, only don't kill it.' The other insisted, 'It shall be neither yours nor mine. Cut it in two.' Then the king spoke up. Give the live child to her, he said, and do not put it to death. She is its mother. When all Israel heard the decision that the king had rendered, they stood in awe of the king, for they saw that he possessed divine wisdom to execute justice. Okay, so raise your hand if you've heard this story before. Okay, when was the last time you guys read this story? My 8-year-old is also raising his hand. When was the last time you read this story? You can just shout it out. Have you all read this story very recently? No, you read when you were a kid, right? It's a story that we all learn as a kid. So what's it like now to read it as an adult? This is what I want to talk about. What are some of the things that you noticed about this story?
So you knew what the end was going to be.
You knew what the end was going to be because you read it as a child. I mean, yeah.
Right.
Well, what was it like? Okay, fine. But like in terms of the narrative structure, in terms of what you're learning from this story.
I would do anything to save my child, give it away just to save my child.
Mm-hmm. So as an
I
adult,
felt it.
you
this
can really
time.
relate to it.
Absolutely.
The one question I always had when I've read this is believing that, every word's put in there for a reason. It's not that two women came to him, it was two prostitutes that came to him. And I was always curious about, why prostitutes.
Right.
I'm not sure what significance that has.
Right.
It was always very confusing.
Yeah. I was reading to today something that was that talked about how I was reading today something about how it shows that Solomon was like an accessible king, that here you have a matter of justice, but it pertains to the theoretically the lowest of the lowest status of society, to prostitutes who are who live alone in this house. They don't have any property or men to protect them. They're extremely vulnerable, but also probably not a well-respected part of society. And that's the story that we're given about Solomon. And so I liked that interpretation of why it was prostitutes and not just two women. It also probably makes sense why we didn't learn that they were prostitutes when we were children. That might have been a little bit confusing for some.
I think also it's a matter of circumstance that they were prostitutes, and it's a matter of circumstance that Solomon became the king. And
I love that, Ruth. Yes.
We're all human at the end. Mothers
Beautiful.
love their children no matter who they are, and it just
Beautiful.
I didn't know they were prostitutes. I thought they were just like women, just in a
sure.
camp.
So
But isn't it also carrying through the theme of humility and how he treated the two prostitutes with respect and the same as he would anyone else? And even now you see in the New Testament, whether it was Mary Magdalene or even now in current days, the Pope washing the feet of people, all this kind of things.
Yes.
Mhm.
People with respect, even the lowest of people.
Right. Beautiful. And, so I just want to, before we move on to Adrienne's interpretation, I want to just focus here on this line where it says, when all Israel heard the decision that the king had rendered, they stood in awe of the king, for they saw that he possessed divine wisdom to execute justice. So that's a callback, right, to this dream prayer that he had, where he asked for that exact thing. He said, please give me, God, give me your wisdom to execute justice. And then this episode is a living example of that fact that he was granted that. Let's pause there. Adrienne's going to share, she's going to drop some of her own divine wisdom on us. and then we'll keep going into the next section of our texts.
Thanks so much, Rabbi. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction in any way, but I will try to get my screen share going to the first in the first instance. Hang on, let me see if I can. Okay, can everyone see that kind of clearly? Okay, great. So this is a painting by Peter Paul Rubens depicting the scene that the rabbi just read to us about the judgment of Solomon, sometimes referred to as the wisdom of Solomon in art history also. And Rubens, as many of you may be aware, was one of the best known Baroque painters in the North. He was a Flemish painter, but really he was one of the most prolific Baroque painters throughout Europe, not just the North. He had a very interesting life and also worked as a diplomat, which is not typical for a really, prolific painter, which he was. But he, in time, created kind of the most vast and productive artists' workshop in Europe in, the sort of first half of the 17th century. To that end, he was so busy, he was appointed court painter to Archduke Albert and later to King Philip IV of Spain. Flanders at this point was under the ruling or the leadership of Catholic ruled Spain for many years, including during his lifetime. So Rubens made a name for himself. Among other things, he painted portraits, yes, for the people for whom he was court painter and many others. He painted landscapes, but he also painted very large scale altarpieces for the Catholic Church. And he was very interested in painting both biblical scenes and mythological scenes, which is, kind of a traditional outgrowth of classical painting and then funneled through the Renaissance, which sort of preceded him in the previous century. This is his Baroque depiction of the Judgment of Solomon. And I think it's an interesting one because it contains some different interpretations of the Baroque theme. A lot of Baroque compositions feature a kind of pyramid, like a pyramidal shape, which this is almost turned a little bit on its side, but in a way we can see. But Rubens divides this composition in a very subtle way, I think, with his use of his color palette. So this woman is presumably the child's real mother because she's gesticulating to the king. We can see the sort of, I don't know if you want to call him the executioner or whoever he is here, wielding a sword, ready to cut this poor baby in half, as the king suggested. And this woman, the baby's real mother, is gesticulating, just give this woman the baby, don't kill this child. And very disturbingly, you see the deceased baby laying in the bottom. The woman who is ultimately granted her child is aligned with the king in the use of the gold robes, which sort of echo the king's own robes, these sort of rich jewel tones, and also the goldish, maybe auburnish tones in his throne. In sort of stark contrast to that, on the upper and, like rightish diagonal part of the composition, the woman who's presumably not the baby's real mother, the one who is willing to have the baby cut in half, is in these sort of icy, silvery blue tones, which are echoed in the rather bizarre, in my estimation, looking pillar behind her and architecture behind her, and also in a way align her with the blue in the executioner's sash here. So I think that was a very sort of subtle way to compose this composition or to divide this composition by Rubens. In all likelihood, this painting was designed by Rubens and completed by members of his workshop because he was so busy with other compositions and other commissions that he likely didn't complete this painting himself, just as an aside. But Rubens is up there with Rembrandt in terms of Netherlandish artists, in terms of renown. He is known for the drama, he's known for the vitality, he's known for the dynamism of his compositions, and I think all of those things are evident here. Rabbi, I know we're a little short on time, so I don't want to take too much more time, and I have another painting to show later, but just quickly, does anybody have any questions, comments?
Yeah, yes, in Rubens' interpretation, these must have been very successful prostitutes. Look how they're dressed and their hair is coiffed. I mean, they really look almost like courtiers, certainly not as I would have depicted them as two prostitutes.
That's a great observation, Carol. I mean, there is a certain elegance to this whole composition, and it belies the nature of what we've just read in the passage, or what we would come to expect from what we've read in the passage. But that is part of the Baroque drama, for which Rubens was renowned. Any other questions, comments? All right, Rabbi, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks so much.
Oh, I just wanted to add really quickly that I also think that the drama in the Rubens piece, it lends itself to the story, the drama in the story, right? And vice versa. That, Solomon could have displayed his wisdom probably through a discussion or some kind of verbal test, but his solution is very visual and graphic, which is, well, go get a knife and hold the knife up in front of this family and make them see that this knife will cut the baby in two, as a way to reveal the true mother. The story itself has a lot of that drama, or a flair for the dramatic, and I think it's just it's underscored in this piece as well.
Oops, Rabbi, you just got muted.
I'm sorry. So we're going to Cecile.
I just wanted to say that whether it was in Sunday school or whatever religious instruction I had back when I was a kid, but we did a lot of coloring. And when I think of that story, I think of coloring the way it was in the paper that we were handed out, and we colored it, whether it was Moses on the mountain or Solomon in the throne. Coloring was a big part of religious instruction back in the 1940s, I guess.
Maybe in the 16 teens also, or when Rubens was a kid.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that you are finding yourself in this narrative, Cecile. That's wonderful. So I had another text about David's wisdom, which I'm not going to share entirely because I think that we are running out of time. But what I want to say, what I found really interesting was that our biblical scholars, especially contemporary scholars, but also our medieval scholars, point out that the reason why Solomon is associated so much with wisdom is not only because of this story that we just looked at, this narrative in 1 Kings 3, but that Solomon is also he is the author of much of our wisdom literature in our sacred texts. The 1,005 songs, 3,000 parables referred to may accord with some of the content of the Song of Songs and Proverbs. So he's attributed it both in this text, but also in our collective memory as being an author, a poet. His credits include the Song of Psalms, Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes. These are all attributed to Solomon. And in the book of Kings itself, we learn that Solomon was also very knowledgeable about natural sciences. It says that he knew a lot about trees and he knew about animals. So there's this depth to Solomon, which is a real shift from the leadership of Saul and David, whose primary talent was military. And it's not to say that Solomon doesn't have military prowess. He does. And we also know that he's the architect of the temple, and a massive almost theological shift from the Ark of the Covenant to a standing temple. So he has a lot of talent in terms of his leadership that we could wrap up under the umbrella of his wisdom. So I wanted to share that because I think when we, often, especially because so much of our Bible learning happens when we're children, we think, oh, Solomon, he found out who the true mom was during that Bible story about the two women. That's what made him wise. But if you look at Solomon's his life and his legacy, it's really much deeper than that. He was a wise king who made decisions on the throne, but he possessed a lot of knowledge. He was a strategic thinker and a prolific writer. Those are the attributes of Solomon that we want to hold with us. Now that I've sung his praises, we're going to transition into the other thing that Solomon is famous for, which is that he had a lot of women. And I actually think that we should start with Adrienne's piece, and then we'll look at the biblical text, because it's good to have a visual about this.
Thanks, Rabbi. Drum roll, please. Okay, everybody, hang on. Just bear with me one quick second.
There it is.
There it is. All right, can everybody see that nice and large? This is a painting by an artist that I'm going to be very honest with you, I myself was not familiar with until I started researching for this class. His name is Franz Franken the Younger. There was, in fact, a Franz Franken the elder. And what I learned is that he too was a Flemish painting in a similar time period as Rubens, who we just saw. They were both working predominantly in the first half of the 17th century. They died within 2 years of one another, actually, in the 1640s. And Franken came from a kind of dynasty of painters that spanned over 100 years, from the late 16th to the late 17th centuries. And interestingly, he, like Rubens, painted for the Catholic Church. He was known for painting altarpieces, but he was predominantly known, just as an aside, as a painter of cabinets. He used to paint decorative scenes on cabinets. Actually, he helped create a whole genre of doing that. And those often featured biblical or mythological scenes, again, very similar to Rubens, except for the medium. Rubens wasn't painting on wood furniture. But this painting is, in fact, an oil on canvas in which Franken depicts Solomon and his women. As Rabbi Schachter will go into in much more detail, I'm sure, Solomon was said to have 700 wives, I guess including the daughter of Pharaoh, as mentioned before, and 300 concubines, in case the 700 wives weren't enough. So I'm not entirely sure if the women depicted here are the wives or the concubines. They seem to be, to Carol's point earlier, they seem to be dressed very elegantly for the most part. But one of the things I find very interesting about this composition is that while it's painted, squarely within the Baroque period, it seems to me that the left-hand side, predominantly the left-hand side of this composition, uses a color palette more associated with the Baroque, maybe a little bit this figure as well. But really, this composition seems to presage Rococo painting in some ways, which comes nearly 100 years later in the 18th century. There's a real delicateness and painterliness to the figures themselves. They almost look like porcelain dolls more than, like human beings. They're in very flowing, sort of delicate drapery, especially on this side of the composition. I think the color palette is much more kind of gentle and subdued than those dramatic Baroque, dark and light contrasts that we've come to know. Yet this also, sorry, I sound like a broken record here, but this also has somewhat of a pyramidal composition. We can see that shape here more clearly than in the Rubens before it, actually, and that is, a squarely Baroque feature. He is just with this bevy of women, all of whom seem to be fawning over him or trying to get his attention, which I will turn it back to Rabbi Schachter after I ask for questions, just to say that that would seem to point to maybe some of the less virtuous aspects of his character or his story. With that, does anybody have any questions before I pass it back to Rabbi Schachter, or observations?
Well, to me, actually, certainly, as you said, one side, everybody is very dark, and the way they're clothed, and certainly not as appealing as the women that are right on the throne. And then you have the same orangey red as you had in the Rubens painting. And I'm wondering if that almost related to Titian, all that red and orange that you kind of see in Titian paintings.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think that Titian in general, I think did have a large influence on the Baroque, but I also want to point out that it's a little hard to tell because it is a very painterly kind of painting. It's loose, it's flowy, it's not, highly structured and highly defined, but it looks as if some of these women are bare-breasted, which might imply that they are the concubines rather than the wives, or who knows. But I mean, that was rather risque in any case, I would say, although certainly there were plenty of nudes in classical antiquity and in the Renaissance. In this kind of context, there's something a bit risque about it, I think. So just worth noting that. Thanks so much, Rabbi, as always.
Wait, don't take away the piece yet. I'm not. I wanted to ask about this here. You can't see my mouse?
No, I can't. Where should I point?
Sculpture that the woman is holding there.
Yep.
Did you read anything about that?
I didn't read anything about it, but I think it's so interesting. She sort of looks like she's at an auction or something, and she's holding up the piece that's for bid. But I have my own interpretations of that, which is that, maybe she's holding up, in a way, this sort of idealized vision of beauty, which is what they are all hoping to be for him. This idealized sense of femininity or whatever. I mean, it also, with my 21st century lens, I would say, that's a female figure being objectified, like he's objectifying, his 700, to some degree, by virtue of their numbers alone, has to be objectifying his 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Right.
But,
so I want to look at the original text because I think that I'm curious if that image there has to do with this shift away from Solomon being an observant, pious person, and it might even be, I don't know how much Franken knew about the actual biblical text, but there is this kind of nod to idolatry in the text. And it really kind of combined with this overwhelming commitment to all of these women to start to portray Solomon as a, less than perfect, king.
Absolutely. And that relates to his, meeting with the Queen of Sheba and things. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So so first of all, Adrienne is available for questions as we keep looking at this text. Thank you so much, Adrienne, as always. It's such a beautiful way to study Torah, to see the way that it's been interpreted by artists over time and in every generation, right? So that's amazing. Okay, can everybody see this screen that I have here? Okay, so this is, whoops, that I didn't mean to do that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so now we're in 1 Kings chapter 11, and we read, they don't mince words here in the Bible. They say, King Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Phoenician, and Hittite women, from the nations of which the Lord had said to the Israelites, none of you shall join them, and none of them shall join you, lest they turn your heart away to follow their gods. Such Solomon clung to and loved. He had 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. In his old age, his wives turned away Solomon's heart after other gods, and he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God as his father David had been. Solomon followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Phoenicians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was displeasing to the Lord and did not remain loyal to the Lord like his father David. At that time, Solomon built a shrine for Shemos, the abomination of Moab, on the hill near Jerusalem, and one for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And he did the same for all his foreign wives who offered and sacrificed to their gods. So that was the part that made me think that maybe that was actually very intentional. And you have in the picture one of these foreign wives who's holding up her cultural god.
I think that's right.
Which is such an, I mean, you would have never thought that you would see that in a painting, this reference to idolatry. But you can see here already, you know, without reading the whole text, that there's all, you know, we've entered into a different space with Solomon. This is a different Solomon than the sweet young man who's praying to God for wisdom, right? Something over the course of his life has corrupted him, perhaps. The being the king and having that much power maybe has really, you know, interrupted his ability to be a pure leader. And we see, you know, we see that there. I want to just look quickly at two commentaries on this. If I can share my screen again here. Okay. So this is actually a little excerpt from the Jewish Women's Archive that has a whole section on King Solomon's harem. So let's look at that. Does everybody see? Okay. So it says Solomon is said to have had a harem that included 300 wives and 700 wives and 300 concubines, right? This is like basically exactly what we read from the text itself. It says that this latter group of women, the women who are from different countries, these foreign women, is usually understood to represent wives who were added to the harem as a means of sealing treaty agreements within these 5 foreign powers, right? Which we see right away at the beginning of Solomon's reign when he marries the daughter of Pharaoh, right? However, here we see something slightly different. It says, the tradition in 1 Kings 11 about Solomon's marriage to foreign wives, whether based on historical records or not, employs the motif of dangerous foreign women to condemn Solomon for idolatry in his later years. It seems to illustrate the prohibition in Deuteronomy against marrying foreign women and also to echo the exclusion of Moab and Edom from the congregation of the Lord in Deuteronomy 23. Foreign women were considered a potential source of trouble because they may not always adopt the culture and values of their husbands and their new place of residence. If they chose to continue to practice their native customs and cults, they would pass these on to their children and might also influence their husbands to adopt some non-Israelite practices as well. Loyalty to and identity with Israelite tradition would be threatened. So Robert Alter also picks up on this, and he says that when we read this sentence, and King Solomon loved many foreign women, these words mark a strong shift in the perception of Solomon. Up to this point, he had been portrayed as an ideally wise and fabulously wealthy king to whom God gave rousing promises and who built God's house in Jerusalem. The previous mentions of his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter do not put that alliance in any negative light. Here, however, the legendary profusion of Solomon's foreign wives, a full 1,000, leads to the sin of idolatry. The Deuteronomistic editor for all the inherited stories of Solomon's grandeur needed an explanation for the splitting of the kingdom after Solomon's death, and he now provides it in in a manner in keeping with Deuteronomy's conception of historical causation, in which idolatry leads to national disaster. So you can see here that the initial text starts to portray Solomon in this negative light around his women. Perhaps the number of women is supposed to make us not wonder like exactly how many, but just the volume of wives as a representation of excess, of absurdity, that things have kind of reached a level that we need to take note of and look down on, right? And this relationship to idolatry, that it's not just excess, but that there's something about the consumption that that Solomon has found himself in as such a negative force in his life. And this is really the beginning of the end for Solomon. Just like all of the other kings that we have spent time with, each one of them has his high points and his low points, right? It starts out with God choosing those individuals and saying, these men are going to be the leaders of this country, and inevitably them not being able to live up to that task. Perhaps another comment on where we began when we started studying 1st and 2nd Samuel, which was that there really is only one true and rightful king, and that king is God. And all of these kings that we've seen are such human beings. They are so fallible. They are, if they don't have bloodlust or revenge, they get caught up with their own desires, their own greed, whether it's financial greed or in this kind of close to final episode of Solomon where he is surrounded by women. I mean, and that's part of what I love about the piece that Adrienne brought for us, where we see so many women around this one man. So I want to just open it up to questions. I know it's 8:05, so if anybody has other things on their mind that they want
I
to
just
share.
had a thought. How do
Yeah.
you make 1,000 women happy? By saying yes to them. And if that means believing or making them think that you believe in every idol and every worship their gods, you get what you want, they get what they want, everybody stays quiet. It's just part of being human. So maybe God just wants to let us know, yes, he's king, but I'm the only real king because everybody else is really human. And as wise as Solomon was, he wasn't so wise. He was just took the easy way out with the
Okay.
women. And
Yeah.
how do you deal with 1,000 women? That's like crazy. That's
Yeah.
like,
Yes, I think it is crazy. I don't actually think we're supposed to believe that he was with 1,000 women, but I think it's supposed to really symbolize for us the consumption that was happening at that time.
I think there's a sort of another theme to this, and this is the separation at that time. If you look at historically, Solomon's lands and whatever being threatened, the split between political practicalities and religion. And as he said, at that time, the way to consolidate and perhaps prevent being invaded is to do alliances. And usually that was through marriage and whatever. And I think Solomon maybe was too smart and was doing too many alliances to fend off what was going on historically at that time. And I can see where the priests, and there was a lot of jealousy and this sort of this split between religion and what you need to do politically to continue to exist. And what happened afterwards, I think follows from that there was a split between, the rabbinical thought and the political thought and what happened to the empire
Or maybe it was just to demonstrate his enormous manhood. I mean, he's the king. He's regal. Look what he can do.
Yeah.
1,000 women, no problem.
Well, I think I'm glad you brought that up. Well, first of all, Jim, thank you for sharing that. It is such an interesting perspective that, like, alliances are good, but then we see how that can be taken to the extreme and end up being bad, right? And I'd say, Carol, to your point, this was something that Adrienne and I talked about while we were prepping for classes. That often we see in the David story, man's ability to kind of perform sexually, to be active as an indication of his power and prowess. And David's story really ends, and actually Saul's too, where these men are too old and too weak to perform anymore, and women are called to try to encourage them, and they're not able to perform, and that's really a reflection of where they are in their lives as king. And here, the last scene that we have of Solomon is being surrounded by 1,000 women, but it's also kind of turned on its head, because it's in that moment where he theoretically could be at the height of his power, both in terms of international alliances and his own sexual prowess. And it's in that very moment where the text tells us that he sinned against God, that he was no longer favored in the eyes of God, and then he dies. I mean, he dies in that same chapter. So it is interesting. We get a almost mixed message there at the end of that story, but definitely a lot of food for thought.
Rabbi, Cecile's been wanting to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cecile.
No, it's fine.
Last painting, the woman to the king's left is holding his scepter, almost in my mind, that the powers have been transferred. I don't know that that's
so interesting
to it. That's not there, but even if it's just joyfully or playfully, oh, here's my scepter, do what you want with it. I don't think that's a good thing for a king to do, pass power or symbols of power on to those who don't deserve it.
Very interesting.
Rabbi, almost to your point, in the beginning, we were talking about Solomon's humility, his respect, and so on. And now at the end, this hubris, this enormous amount of testosterone that he must have possessed, and all these women, and then suddenly he dies. Yeah. And so it was turned against him at that point.
Right. Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. Well, thank you everyone for another fantastic episode of the David story. The next time we meet, we're actually not going to be talking about any one character of the David story, but we're going to be looking at themes of power, and all of the things that come with power in the David story, thinking about questions of corruption, of leadership, of power, a little bit of the gender dynamic as well. We're going to be zooming out for our last class, our last Zoom class, and I hope that you can all join us for that final session. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Good
I think
night.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you,
thank
Adrienne.
you, Adrienne. That was great.
Oh, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for being here.